The morning mist clung to the weathered docks of Harbor Point like a ghost's breath, painting the world in hazy watercolors of gray and blue. 6-year-old Emma Jenkins knelt at the edge of her father's fishing pier, small fingers working methodically to coil a rope exactly as Daddy had taught her. Beside her, Rex, a muscular German shepherd with soulful eyes and a scarred ear, stood sentinel, his posture relaxed yet somehow vigilant in a way most dogs weren't. The peace shattered with the distant rumble of motorcycles, a sound that didn't belong in the gentle symphony of creaking boats and lapping waves. Rex's ears pricked forward, his body tensing imperceptibly. Emma didn't hear the approaching danger. Her partial hearing loss meant the low frequencies often escaped her, but she felt the change in Rex, his body suddenly alert against her side. Around the harbor bend they came 5 motorcycles, chrome gleaming in the morning light, leather-clad riders moving like dark specters through the mist. Emma's small hand reached instinctively for Rex's collar as the lead rider cut his engine, the sudden silence more menacing than the roar. In the eerie quiet, the man's boots crunched against gravel as he dismounted, eyes fixing on the little girl and her dog with predatory interest. What he couldn't know, what none of them realized, was that the seemingly ordinary shepherd watching them with calculated intensity had been forged in the fires of war, trained to protect at all costs. And as the bikers circled closer to Mark Jenkins' little girl, they were about to learn what happens when you threaten a military dog's charge. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Harbor Point had once been a prosperous fishing town, its waterfront lined with generational family businesses and boats that had weathered decades of storms. Now, like many coastal communities, it struggled against the tide of economic hardship that seemed to wash away a little more of its charm each year. Still, the residents maintained traditions like the annual Memorial Day service for a day. Those lost at sea, a solemn gathering where candles floated on the harbor waters as names were read aloud. Most locals still knew each other by first name, shared Sunday potlucks at the weathered community hall, and kept watchful eyes on each other's children. But beneath this veneer of small-town solidarity, tensions had begun to simmer as businesses shuttered and outsiders with questionable intentions began eyeing the vulnerable waterfront properties. At the heart of this community lived Emma Jenkins, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with honey blonde pigtails and the hearing aids she often decorated with colorful stickers. 2 years ago, Emma had lost her mother Catherine in a boating accident during a sudden squall, the same accident that had left the child with partial hearing loss. Emma's father, Mark Jenkins, a former Navy combat medic who now ran a struggling charter fishing business, had somehow found the strength to rebuild their world around just the two of them. Their small blue cottage overlooking the harbor was modest but warm, filled with Catherine's photographs and Emma's colorful artwork. Each morning before school, Emma would help her father prepare his boat, her small hands learning the tools of a trade generations of Jenkins men had practiced. The locals marveled at her resilience, though few missed the shadow that sometimes crossed her face when boats returned at day's end. Rex had come into their lives 4 years ago, a battle-scarred German shepherd with intelligent eyes and military bearing. He had belonged to Sarah Miller, Mark's cousin and a decorated K-9 handler who had been fatally wounded in Afghanistan. Before dying, Sarah had made Mark promise that Rex, who had saved her life twice during combat operations, would have a home. What began as an obligation soon became salvation. Rex not only became Emma's fiercely devoted guardian, but also her ears when her hearing failed her. The dog responded to over 40 hand signals, could alert Emma to approaching people she couldn't hear, and somehow sensed her nightmares before they fully gripped her. Few in Harbor Point realized they were watching a highly trained military asset at work. They simply saw a devoted pet. Fewer still knew what Rex was truly capable of when those he protected were threatened. The morning dawned clear over Harbor Point, the kind of pristine spring day that reminded locals why they endured harsh winters in this remote coastal town. Emma Jenkins sat cross-legged on her father's dock, methodically organizing fishing lures in the tackle box while humming softly to herself. Her small fingers moved with surprising dexterity, separating hooks by size just as her father had taught her. Though only 6, Emma carried herself with the quiet competence of a child who had grown up around boats and water. Occasionally she would pause to adjust her hearing aid, a habit she'd developed whenever concentrating deeply. Rex lay beside her, head on paws but eyes constantly moving, scanning the waterfront with military precision. The German Shepherd's surveillance appeared casual to untrained observers, but he was perpetually alert, a silent guardian programmed to identify threats before they materialized. When Emma occasionally signed to him simple hand gestures Sarah had taught them both, Rex would respond with immediate understanding, shifting position or fetching items with remarkable precision. "Morning there, little captain," called old Pete, limping down the weathered planks with a thermos in hand. "Your daddy radioing yet?" Despite his 80 years, Pete still arrived at the harbor each dawn, though arthritis had long since ended his fishing career. Emma looked up, her face brightening. "Not yet," he said. "They had to go out farther today. Not enough fish close in." Pete nodded gravely, the economic reality of Harbor Point's declining fishing stocks understood even by its children. "Well, you tell him the barometer's dropping when he calls. Storm might blow in faster than the weather service is saying." He patted Rex's head, one of the few people besides the Jenkins family the dog permitted such familiarity. "This boy looking after you proper?" Emma nodded emphatically. "Rex knows when the phone rings even when I don't hear it. And he growled at Mr. Taylor yesterday when he came up behind me too fast." Pete chuckled. "Smart animal. Smarter than most people I know." As he moved away, Emma noticed Mike Henderson, the harbor master, watching from his office window. Unlike his predecessor, who had run the harbor for 30 years, Mike had only arrived last summer. Something about the way he studied her father's boat slip made Emma uneasy. She'd mentioned it to her father once, but he'd simply said, "Sometimes people just have serious faces, sweetheart." Rex suddenly raised his head, ears pivoting toward the harbor entrance, long before Emma heard anything. The dog's muscles tensed beneath his fur, though he didn't bark, a warning sign Emma recognized from their years together. Something was coming that Rex considered potentially threatening. The motorcycles appeared like dark apparitions through the morning haze, 5 riders breaking the harbor's tranquility with aggressive engine growls. They moved in perfect formation, leather cuts, bearing patches identifying them as the Steel Vipers MC. Their arrival sent an immediate ripple through the harbor. Old Pete retreated toward the bait shop, and 2 fishermen mending nets nearby straightened, their faces hardening. The lead rider, a tall man with a graying beard and arms covered in faded tattoos, killed his engine at the harbor parking lot. "That's the Jenkins slip, right?" he asked loudly, pointing toward where Emma sat. His companions dismounted, spreading out in what seemed like practice formation. From his office, Mike Henderson emerged, moving quickly toward the group. "Morning, gentlemen. Something I can help you with." His voice carried a nervousness that Emma caught even at a distance. "Just getting the lay of the land," the leader replied, removing mirrored sunglasses. "Heard there might be business opportunities in Harbor Point. I'm Jack. These are my associates." He gestured vaguely at the other riders. Rex had risen to a standing position now, placing himself between Emma and the newcomers without being commanded. The dog's posture remained casual to untrained eyes, but Emma recognized his combat stance, weight balanced perfectly, ready to explode into action. Mike's eyes darted nervously between the bikers and Emma. "This is a private marina, unless you've got boat business." Actually, Jack interrupted, "We're looking into security concerns in coastal properties. Heard some local businesses might need protection services." The way he emphasized protection made the harbor master flinch visibly. Mike lowered his voice, though Emma could still read his lips. "Look, not in front of the kid, all right? We can discuss this later." Jack's attention shifted fully to Emma then, his eyes narrowing as he studied the small girl and her unusually attentive dog. "Jenkins kid, huh? Heard he's been having trouble keeping his charter business afloat." He started walking toward the dock, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden planks. 2 of his companions followed, while the others remained with their bikes, effectively blocking the main exit from the harbor. Emma felt fear rising in her chest, but remembered her father's lessons about not showing fear around strangers. My daddy will be back soon, she said firmly, rising to her feet. He doesn't like people on his dock without permission. Jack smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. Aren't you a brave little thing? Don't worry, we're just being neighborly. He took another step forward. Rex moved then, his transformation immediate and startling. The seemingly relaxed pet vanished, replaced by a military-trained protector. He didn't growl or bark. Instead, he positioned himself with precision, body angled perfectly between Emma and the approaching men. His ears flattened against his skull, and his eyes locked on Jack with unnerving intensity. The change was so sudden, so professional, that Jack halted mid-step. That's quite a dog you've got there. Something in his tone had shifted recognition, perhaps, from a man familiar with trained animals. Rex doesn't like strangers coming too close, Emma said, her hand instinctively finding the dog's collar. Daddy says he's special. Special how? Jack asked, his eyes never leaving the dog. Before Emma could answer, Mike's phone rang. The harbor master stepped away to answer it, his voice low and urgent. Emma couldn't hear what was said, but Mike's expression changed as he glanced toward the harbor entrance. Your daddy's calling in? Jack asked, taking another experimental step forward. Rex responded by showing teeth, not in an uncontrolled snarl, but in a calculated warning display that military handlers would instantly recognize. The message was unmistakable. Another step would have consequences. One of Jack's companions whispered something, tugging at his leader's leather jacket. Boss, that dog ain't right. Look at the stance. Jack nodded slowly, reassessing the situation. Well, we'll continue our conversation with your father then. Tell him the Steel Vipers came calling. Tell him we're very interested in providing services to his operation. As they backed away, returning to their motorcycles, Emma noticed Mike Henderson watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. He slipped back into his office, making another call. Rex remained vigilant until the motorcycle's roar faded into the distance, but Emma knew this wasn't over. Something in the leader's eyes told her they would be back. She reached for her father's radio, her small fingers turning to the emergency channel they'd practiced using dozens of times. Daddy, she said when the static cleared. Some men came. Rex didn't like them. She paused, glancing at the harbor master's office where Mike was watching her through the window. I think Mr. Henderson knows them. Mark Jenkins's chartered fishing boat, the Catherine Ann, approached Harbor Point's entrance at full throttle, leaving a wake that slapped angrily against the jetty walls. He had cut the day's excursion brutally short, refunding his frustrated tourists without explanation after Emma's crackling radio message. 20 years in the Navy had taught him to recognize genuine fear beneath composure, and his daughter's controlled voice had triggered every protective instinct he possessed. Through his binoculars, he could already see Emma and Rex at the dock's edge, the dog's alert posture visible even at a distance. As he maneuvered the boat into its slip with practiced precision, Mark cataloged his surroundings with the methodical attention of someone who had navigated hostile waters. 5 motorcycles now sat prominently near the harbor master's office. Mike Henderson stood nearby, his body language screaming discomfort. Old Pete positioned himself casually on a bench with a clear sightline to Emma, his gnarled hand resting near the filleting knife in his pocket. The community's invisible defense systems were activating. Harbor Point took care of its own. Everyone stays on board, Mark instructed his remaining crew member, a college student who worked summers. Radio the Coast Guard if I'm not back in 15 minutes. Use the phrase mechanical inspection required. They'll understand. The young man nodded, confusion evident on his face, but training overriding questions. Mark stepped onto the dock with deliberate casualness, his weathered appearance, faded jeans, flannel shirt, sun-creased face revealing nothing of his military background. Nothing, perhaps, except the measured way he moved and the careful assessment in his eyes. Unlike the Navy SEAL his cousin Sarah had been, Mark's combat medic training had emphasized stabilizing situations rather than eliminating threats. It was an approach that had served him well in both war zones and single parenthood. "Emma, sweetheart," he called, keeping his voice light. "Everything okay here?" Before Emma could answer, the biker leader Jack stepped forward. "You must be Jenkins. Been waiting to chat with you." He extended a hand that Mark didn't immediately take. "Jack Keller. My associates and I are exploring business opportunities in Harbor Point." Mark positioned himself slightly in front of Emma while maintaining the appearance of an unthreatening stance. "What kind of business brings motorcycle clubs to a fishing harbor?" His eyes flicked briefly to Mike Henderson, whose gaze dropped immediately to the ground. "Protection services," Jack replied smoothly. "Small communities like this are vulnerable. Accidents happen. Boats catch fire. Equipment gets damaged." Each word landed with precise threat. "For a reasonable monthly contribution, we ensure those unfortunate events don't touch your operation." Mark felt Emma's small hand grip the back of his pant leg. Rex stood perfectly positioned to guard both father and daughter, his training evident in every muscle. "We already have police protection in Harbor Point," Mark said evenly. "And a pretty tight community." Jack laughed, the sound echoing across the suddenly quiet harbor. "Police like Deputy Wilkins over there?" He gestured toward a nervous-looking officer who had appeared at the harbor entrance but made no move to approach. "Yeah, we've come to an understanding with local law enforcement about our community involvement." The pieces clicked together in Mark's mind: the deputy's reluctance, Mike's nervous behavior, the coordinated arrival of the Steel Vipers. This wasn't a random shakedown, it was an orchestrated takeover attempt with inside help. One of the bikers, a muscular man with a shaved head, moved suddenly, stepping toward Emma. "Cute kid, be a shame if—" He never finished the sentence. Rex moved with explosive speed, placing himself between the biker and Emma, his teeth bared in silent warning. The transformation from docile pet to combat-ready asset was instantaneous and unmistakable. Simultaneously, Mark's hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with precise pressure on nerve clusters that sent immediate, radiating pain up his arm. "Don't," Mark said quietly, still maintaining his everyman appearance despite the combat hold. "Please don't take another step toward my daughter." The biker's eyes widened in shock at both the dog's professional stance and Mark's unexpectedly effective grip. He twisted, attempting to break free, only to find himself efficiently redirected to one knee, his arm still captured in Mark's seemingly casual hold. "What the hell?" Jack's voice carried genuine surprise. He assessed Mark with new respect. "You're not just some fisherman, are you?" Mark released the biker, who scrambled back, rubbing his wrist. "I was a combat medic. 3 tours. I know how the human body works, how to heal it and how to hurt it." He kept his voice matter of fact. "I'm just here to run my business and raise my daughter. I don't want trouble. That is over. Lots of late." "Combat medic," Jack repeated, a flash of something recognition perhaps crossing his face. "Army?" "Well, Army?" "Navy," Mark corrected. "Attached to Marine units primarily." A low whistle escaped from one of the other bikers. "No wonder the dog's got military bearing. You trained him?" "No," Mark said. "His training came before us." He deliberately omitted Sarah's role, unwilling to provide these men with any personal information they might exploit. The standoff might have continued, but old Pete chose that moment to approach, his limp pronounced but his back straight. "Mark, Coast Guard issued a storm warning. Big system moving in faster than expected." The old man's eyes never left Jack as he delivered the news. "Might want to secure everything early. Could be we'll be cut off by nightfall." Other figures had begun to emerge around the harbor. Bill Thompson from the charter operation 2 slips down, Sandra Kelly, who ran the chandlery, Diego Martinez from the processing plant. Each appeared engaged in routine tasks while gradually positioning themselves within line of sight. Harbor Point was silently mobilizing around the Jenkins family. Jack noticed the gathering observers and measured the changing dynamics. "We'll continue this conversation later, Jenkins." Think about our offer." He signaled to his men with a subtle head movement. As the bikers began to retreat, Deputy Wilkins finally approached, though he stopped well short of the confrontation. "Everything all right here, folks?" he called out, his hand conspicuously far from his service weapon. "Just fine, Deputy," Jack answered before Mark could speak. "Just introducing ourselves to the local business community." The way his eyes lingered on the officer spoke volumes about their prior arrangement. "Mr. Jenkins?" the deputy asked, finally meeting Mark's gaze. "We're fine for now," Mark replied, emphasizing the last two words. "Though I'm curious why Harbor Point's law enforcement seems reluctant to check on a confrontation involving a 6-year-old child." The deputy's face flushed. "I was monitoring from a tactical distance. Standard procedure." "Is it?" Mark asked quietly. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, Jack turned back. "You've got interesting skills for a fisherman, Jenkins. Your dog, too. But skills don't change the reality Harbor Point needs our protection, and that includes you. We'll be back after the storm passes." He revved his engine. "Think about what matters most to you." The threat hung in the air as they departed. Mark immediately knelt beside Emma, checking her for any signs of trauma. "You did exactly right, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Around them, harbor residents began converging, their faces grim with understanding. Old Pete voiced what everyone was thinking: they'll be back, and not just 5 of them next time. "And our police won't help," Bill Thompson added, glaring at the departing deputy. Mark looked around at the gathering community, then at the darkening sky that promised isolation from outside help. The storm would trap them with whatever came next. "Then we help ourselves," he said simply. "Harbor Point protected my family when we needed it most. Now we protect Harbor Point." Rex pressed against Emma's side, his military training temporarily hidden beneath the guise of a concerned pet. But Mark knew they all knew now that the German Shepherd represented something Harbor Point desperately needed: a defender trained to face overwhelming odds without flinching. The approaching storm would bring more than rain and wind to their shores. It would bring a reckoning. The afternoon sky darkened prematurely as the first bands of the approaching storm system swept across Harbor Point. Inside Maggie's Diner, a weather-beaten establishment that had fed fishermen for 3 generations, Mark Jenkins studied the faces of the 24 community members who had gathered in urgent response to the morning's confrontation. Emma sat in a corner booth, coloring quietly with crayons Maggie had provided, Rex positioned protectively at her feet. The dog's eyes never stopped moving, tracking each person who approached the child with professional vigilance. "They'll be back with more men," Mark said, his voice cutting through the anxious murmurs. "And based on what we saw today, we can't count on Deputy Wilkins or anyone from the Sheriff's Department." Bill Thompson, a former Coast Guard officer whose charter business neighbored Mark's, leaned forward. Mike Henderson practically invited them in. Been watching him for weeks, making calls from the harbor office after hours, meeting strangers at the South Pier. "Something ain't right with that boy." "My nephew works dispatch over in Clayton County," Maggie added, refilling coffee cups with mechanical efficiency that belied her concern. "Says the Steel Vipers started moving into coastal towns last year. They find economically struggling places, get a foothold through intimidation, then expand. 3 towns down the coast are already paying protection after suspicious accidents convince folks to cooperate." Old Pete slammed his gnarled fist on the table. "My father and his father before him built this harbor. I'll burn my own boat before I let some motorcycle gang run us off." The fierce declaration sparked a wave of agreement, but Sandra Kelly, who ran the chandlery with her husband, raised a cautioning hand. "Pete and Cole, they aren't just some weekend bikers. My brother's on the state police force. The Steel Vipers have ex-military among guys with combat experience and connections. They've been careful to stay just inside the law while making it impossible for local businesses to operate without their protection." Mark noticed how the room divided in reaction, half nodding grimly in acceptance of the difficult situation, others like Pete hardening with determination. Harbor Point was split between pragmatism and principle, between fear and fight. "What exactly happened this morning, Mark?" Pastor Mitchell asked from his corner seat. The elderly minister had counseled 3 generations through hardships, from fishing accidents to economic downturns. Mark recounted the confrontation in detail, carefully omitting any mention of Sarah's connection to Rex or his own specific military training. When he finished, the room fell silent until Diego Martinez, whose family had run the processing plant for decades, spoke up. "They targeted your little girl deliberately, Mark. That crosses a line even protection rackets usually respect." His accent thickened with anger. "In my country, we learned what happens when good people stay silent too long." Before anyone could respond, the diner's door swung open, letting in a gust of wind and Deputy Wilkins. Conversations died instantly. The officer scanned the gathered crowd with obvious discomfort. "This an official town meeting I wasn't informed about?" he asked, attempting authority but achieving only awkwardness. "Just neighbors having coffee before the storm hits," Maggie replied, her tone deliberately neutral. "Can I get you something, Deputy?" Wilkins shifted his weight, clearly aware of the united front facing him. "Just doing storm checks. Harbor master says we need to secure all vessels by sundown. County's declared a weather emergency." His eyes found Mark. "Jenkins got a minute outside?" Mark nodded to Emma to stay put and followed the deputy onto the diner's covered porch. Rain had begun to fall in earnest, drumming against the metal roof. "Look," Wilkins said once they were alone, his voice barely audible above the rain. "I know how this looks, but you don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," Mark replied evenly. The deputy glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Steel Vipers aren't just here for Harbor Point. They've got people in the county government, connections in the state police. Sheriff Reynolds is 3 months from retirement and doesn't want waves." He swallowed hard. "My wife's brother got crosswise with him in Millerton last year. His boat burned with him on it, ruled accidental." "So you're saying roll over? Let 'em intimidate a kindergartner?" Wilkins flinched. "I'm saying be smart. Pay their protection, keep your head down, and they mostly leave you alone once established. Fight them," and he trailed off, eyes darting again to the storm. "Jenkins, they'll be back after this weather clears, probably 20 or 30 of them. What exactly do you think a bunch of aging fishermen are going to do against those odds?" Mark studied the man before him, not corrupt so much as broken, worn down by the slow erosion of his professional ethics through fear. "I appreciate the warning, Deputy. Is that all?" Wilkins looked like he wanted to say more, but simply nodded and hurried back to his patrol car through the intensifying rain. Inside, Mark found the conversation had fragmented into heated debates about resistance versus practical accommodation. Emma had fallen asleep in the booth, her head resting against Rex's side. The sight crystallized something within him. This wasn't just about protection, money, or principle. It was about preserving a community where his daughter could grow up without fear. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the arguments. "First priority is getting everyone safely situated for the storm. Bill, what's the latest forecast?" Bill checked his weather radar app. Category 2, making landfall around midnight. "We'll be cut off for at least 24 hours. Bridge access will be closed, and cell service always goes first around here." "Then we use the time," Mark decided. "Sandra, you mentioned your brother's with the state police. Can you get word to him about what's happening here?" She nodded. "If I can get a call out before service drops." "Do it. Pastor Mitchell, your church has the highest ground in town. We should consider moving vulnerable residents there until the storm passes." As plans formed and tasks were assigned, Mark found himself remembering another time when careful preparation had meant the difference between life and death, a remote outpost in Afghanistan where his medical unit had been cut off by enemy forces. He remembered Sarah there working with Rex as they secured the perimeter, the dog responding to hand signals with uncanny precision. The memory triggered a realization. "Where's Carter?" he asked suddenly. "Probably at the lighthouse," old Pete answered. "Storm or no storm, he keeps that light running. Says it's the only job that matters in weather like this." Mark nodded. Carter Dawson, who maintained the decommissioned but still functional lighthouse as a historical landmark, was a reclusive Vietnam veteran who rarely came to town. But his elevated position provided the best vantage point of Harbor Point's single-access road. "Emma and Rex will stay with Carter during the storm," Mark decided. "It's the safest high ground, and I need eyes on that road in case they try to move in despite the weather." As the meeting dispersed, people hurrying to storm preparations, Mark carried his sleeping daughter to his truck with Rex following vigilantly. The rain had intensified, slanting horizontally in the strengthening wind, but he settled Emma in the back seat, and as Rex jumped in beside her, Mark caught a glimpse of something that made him freeze momentarily, a familiar series of numbers tattooed inside the dog's ear, partially hidden by scar tissue. Sarah had mentioned the identification system for military working dogs, but Mark had never looked closely at Rex's markings before. The revelation sent his mind racing back 4 years to the military hospital where he'd said goodbye to his dying cousin. Sarah's voice, weak but insistent. "Rex isn't just any military dog, Mark. His training is specialized. Promise me you'll keep him with Emma." "Promise me." He'd assumed it was simply a dying woman's concern for her beloved partner, but now he wondered what specialized training she had meant. What exactly was Rex capable of? The winding road to the lighthouse required careful navigation in the deteriorating weather. Carter met them at the door, his weathered face unsurprised despite the lack of phone call to warn him of their arrival. "Figured someone smart would think of high ground," the older veteran said, helping Mark carry the still sleeping Emma inside. "Storm's going to be worse than they're saying." "Always is." The lighthouse keeper's quarters were sparse but meticulously maintained, military precision evident in the perfect hospital corners of the bed where Mark laid Emma. Rex immediately settled beside her, eyes alertly tracking both men. "Military dog," Carter observed, not missing the animal's disciplined positioning. "K9? Or something more interesting?" Mark studied the older man carefully. "My cousin's. She was a handler." Carter nodded, seemingly satisfied with the limited information. "Coffee's on. Storm watch is long work." As they settled in the lighthouse's small kitchen, the wind howling around the stone structure, Carter revealed his own strategic thinking. "Been watching that harbor master. Makes calls from his boat after hours, thinks nobody notices. Started right after his gambling debts got called in down in Atlantic City." "You think he's working with the Steel Vipers?" "No, he is," Carter confirmed. "Question is whether it's willing cooperation or coercion." He sipped his coffee. "Man with debts that size is vulnerable. Doesn't make him blameless, but might explain a few things." The revelation added another layer of complexity to their situation. If Mike had been coerced through financial pressure, others in town might be similarly compromised. A sudden crackling from Carter's weather radio interrupted them. "Mandatory evacuation order for coastal areas. Bridge access will be restricted to emergency vehicles only as of 5 p.m. Residents are advised." The evacuation means the road will be clear, Mark thought aloud. If the bikers wanted to move without witnesses. A sharp bark from the bedroom cut him off. Rex stood in the doorway, ears alert, eyes fixed on the window. Emma stirred behind him, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What is it, boy?" Mark moved to the window, peering through rain-streaked glass down the winding road. Headlights appeared intermittently through the storm, not emergency vehicles, but a convoy moving steadily toward town despite evacuation orders. Carter joined him, binoculars in hand. Motorcycles under tarps on trailers. 2 trucks. I count at least 15 men. He handed the binoculars to Mark. "And your harbor master's SUV lead them in." Mark focused the lenses, confirming Carter's assessment with a sinking feeling. The Steel Vipers weren't waiting for the storm to pass, they were using it as cover, confident that evacuation orders would empty the town of potential resistance. "I need to warn everyone at the church," Mark said, reaching for his radio. Static answered his call. The storm had already knocked out communications. "Daddy?" Emma stood in the doorway, Rex at her side. "Are the bad men coming back?" Mark knelt to her level. "Some people are coming to town who don't understand what Harbor Point is about. We're going to help them understand that this is our home." Emma studied his face with surprising perception. "Like when Sarah told us about Rex protecting their base. When bad people came." The innocent question froze Mark momentarily. He'd never told Emma details about Sarah's combat experiences. "When did Sarah tell you that, sweetheart?" "Before she went to heaven. She showed me Rex's special signals." Emma made a quick hand gesture that Mark didn't recognize, but Rex immediately moved to the window, assuming a perfect sentry position. Carter's eyebrows rose. "Your daughter can command that dog?" "Apparently," Mark whispered, watching as Emma made another subtle gesture that repositioned Rex to cover the door. "Sarah said Rex would always protect me," Emma explained matter-of-factly. "She taught him my heartbeat." The simplicity of the child's statement belied its significance. Military dogs trained to recognize the specific heartbeat patterns of their handlers represented the highest level of specialized training units typically reserved for the most elite operations. "Does Rex know other special signals?" Carter asked carefully. Emma nodded. "Lots. But Sarah said they're only for emergencies." Mark's mind raced with the implications. If Rex wasn't simply a protection-trained military dog, but something more specialized, it would explain his extraordinary behavior. Sarah hadn't just left them a pet, she'd left them a guardian with capabilities Mark had never fully understood. "We need to get back to town," Mark decided. "Those people coming in need to know Harbor Point isn't theirs for the taking." Carter shook his head. "Road's not safe. They've got men positioned along it by now." He crossed to a cabinet, unlocking it to reveal communication equipment more sophisticated than a lighthouse keeper should possess. "I've got another way to reach the church. Old emergency system from when this was still a Coast Guard station." As Carter established communication with Pastor Mitchell, warning of the incoming threat, Mark knelt beside Emma. "Sweetheart, I need you to stay here with Carter where it's safe. Rex will stay with you." Emma's small face set with determination that reminded Mark painfully of her mother. "No, Daddy, we stay together. Rex protects both of us." She made another hand signal, and Rex moved to position himself between them, clearly ready to accompany both. "Mark," Carter called, "Pastor says they've spotted vehicles entering town. Harbor Point Marina is their first stop." The situation was deteriorating faster than anticipated. Mark weighed his options, knowing that leaving Emma, even with Carter and Rex, carried its own risks if the bikers discovered the lighthouse. A sudden commotion outside drew them to the window. Through the driving rain, they could make out a figure struggling up the lighthouse path. Mike Henderson, soaked and desperate, pounding on the door moments later. Carter opened it cautiously, shotgun visible but not aimed. "Harbor Master. Interesting time for a social call." Mike staggered in, rain streaming from his jacket. His eyes widened at the sight of Mark and Emma. "Jenkins, thank God. They're coming. All of them. Jack found out I warned you this morning." He pushed back his sleeve to reveal bruises forming on his forearm. "I got away while they were unloading at the marina." "Why should we believe you?" Mark demanded. "You led them here." "Not by choice." Mike's voice cracked. "They've got evidence of my gambling enough to put me in prison. Said they'd forget it if I helped them establish here." His eyes fell on Emma, shame crossing his face. "I never thought they'd target a child. That wasn't part of what they told me." Before Mark could respond, Rex growled, a sound different from his earlier warnings. The dog moved to the window, hairs rising along his spine. Carter joined him, peering through specialized night vision equipment. "We've got problems. 3 men coming up the path, armed." Mike paled. "They must have followed me." I'm sorry I didn't think. Emma, Mark said firmly, remember how we practice for emergencies? This is one of those times. What's the first rule? Listen to Daddy and stay quiet, she whispered, eyes wide but voice steady. Mark turned to Rex, hoping his limited knowledge of commands would work. Guard, he ordered, pointing to Emma. The dog's response was immediate and surprising. Rather than simply moving to Emma's side, Rex herded her expertly into the small bathroom, the room with no windows and a solid door, positioning himself inside with her. Smart animal, Carter murmured, checking his shotgun. Almost like he's done this before. He has, Mike said unexpectedly. That's a specialized operations dog. I recognized the training when I saw him work this morning. When both men stared at him, he added, I was military police before all this. Worked with K-9 units occasionally. Outside, the approaching men were now visible through the rain, moving with tactical precision that confirmed Sandra's warning about ex-military members within the Steel Vipers. Three choices, Carter said calmly. Surrender and hope they just want to intimidate us. Barricade and wait for help that might not come. Or send a message about what happens when you threaten Harbor Point families. Mark thought of the community gathered at the church, unaware that their harbor was already being infiltrated. He thought of Emma hiding in the bathroom with a dog whose capabilities he was only beginning to understand. And he thought of Sarah, who had entrusted both Emma's safety and Rex's specialized skills to him for exactly this kind of moment. Mike, he said quietly, you brought them here. Are you with Harbor Point now, or are you with them? The harbor master straightened, something resolving in his face. I made a terrible mistake. Let me help fix it. Mark nodded, decision made. Carter, how well does your emergency communication system reach through this storm? Clear to the church. Spotty to mainland authorities. Tell Pastor Mitchell that Harbor Point Marina is compromised. Tell everyone to implement the hurricane defense protocol. As Carter relayed the message, Mark turned to Mike. Those men coming up the path, do they know this building's layout? No, Jack just told them to follow me. Secure anyone here. Mark's mind filled with medical knowledge of a different sort, pressure points, vulnerable anatomical targets, incapacitation techniques he'd learned for battlefield situations when medicines ran out but suffering needed to end. Combat medics were taught to heal first, but also how to efficiently neutralize threats when necessary. Then let's teach them something about Harbor Point hospitality during a storm, he said grimly, positioning himself beside the door. When this is over, Emma will either see that her community stood tall or that it knelt in fear. I know which lesson I want my daughter to learn. The pounding on the lighthouse door began as the wind reached screaming pitch around the stone structure. The storm had arrived in Harbor Point, but it wasn't the only force of nature the Steel Vipers would face tonight. Inside the bathroom, Rex pressed protectively against Emma, his specialized training ready to deploy at the first sign of danger to his charge. The little girl placed her hand on his fur, feeling his steady heartbeat against her palm, and whispered the phrase Sarah had taught her years ago. We stand our ground, Rex. We always stand our ground. The storm intensified to a feral howl as Mark positioned himself beside the lighthouse door, exchanging silent signals with Carter about their defensive strategy. 3 armed men against 2 decent odds compared to situations Mark had faced during his deployments, but the presence of Emma complicated everything. The lighthouse keeper had extinguished all but one dim emergency light, creating disorienting shadows that would work to their advantage. Remember, Mark whispered to Mike, we're not trying to kill anyone. Incapacitate only. The harbor master nodded nervously, clutching a heavy flashlight Carter had provided as his only weapon. The transformation in Mike was remarkable, from compromised conspirator to determined defender in the space of minutes. Fear still etched his features, but something stronger had taken root alongside it, resolve. The pounding at the door grew more insistent. Anderson. Open up. A voice bellowed over the storm. We know you're in there. Carter caught Mark's eye, pointed to himself, then to the narrow staircase leading to the lighthouse's upper level. Mark nodded, understanding the older veteran would provide high ground coverage. As Carter silently ascended the spiral stairs, Mark pressed his back to the wall beside the door, motioning for Mike to stand visibly in the center of the room, weapons hidden. Coming, Mike called out, voice convincingly terrified. "Don't shoot. I'm alone." He threw the deadbolt and immediately retreated as the door crashed open, admitting 3 rain-soaked figures. The first man entered cautiously, assault-style shotgun sweeping the dimly lit space. The second followed with a handgun, while the third secured the door against the howling wind. "Where are they, Mike?" the lead man demanded, water dripping from his leather cut. "Jack says you're harboring the fisherman and his kid." Mike raised his hands. "Nobody here but me. I just needed someplace dry to wait out the storm." The second biker advanced, suspicion evident in his movements. "Jack said the kid would be here with that weird dog. Check the other rooms," he ordered the third man. As the gunman turned toward the hallway leading to the bathroom where Emma and Rex hid, Mark made his move. Years of medical training had taught him precisely how the human body worked, not just how to heal it, but where its vulnerabilities lay. His arm snaked around the lead man's neck in a blood choke technique that restricted carotid blood flow without affecting the airway. The biker's shotgun clattered to the floor as his hands instinctively flew to his throat, consciousness fading within seconds. Mike swung his flashlight with surprising effectiveness, catching the second man on the temple before he could turn fully. The blow wasn't elegant, but it dropped the biker to one knee, his handgun discharging harmlessly into the floorboards. The third man reacted quickly, raising his weapon toward Mark, but a blur of movement from the stairwell interrupted his aim. Carter landed on him from above, both men crashing to the floor in a tangle of limbs. The biker was younger and stronger, but Carter fought with the grim efficiency of someone who had known jungle warfare. They rolled across the floor, struggling for control of the gun. Mark lowered his unconscious opponent carefully to the ground, ensuring the airway remained clear, combat medic training instinctively asserting itself even now. He moved to help Carter when a sharp crack echoed through the lighthouse, the biker's gun discharging during the struggle. Carter grunted, rolling away, clutching his side, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. The remaining biker scrambled to his feet, weapon raised, when a new sound froze everyone in place, a low, bone-chilling growl from the hallway. Rex stood there, hackles raised, eyes locked on the armed threat, his entire posture transformed from family pet to military weapon. Behind him, Emma peered around the doorframe, her eyes wide but remarkably calm. "Rex, protect," she commanded with surprising authority. What happened next occurred so quickly that Mike would later struggle to describe it coherently. The German Shepherd launched forward in a blur of calculated aggression, not attacking wildly but executing what appeared to be a trained disarmament maneuver. His jaws clamped on the biker's wrist with precisely calibrated pressure enough to compress nerve bundles and trigger an involuntary muscle release, sending the gun clattering across the floor, but not breaking skin. The man screamed more from shock than pain, falling backward as Rex maintained position, pinning him effectively without causing serious injury. The dog's disciplined restraint was almost more terrifying than aggression would have been. This wasn't an animal attacking, but a trained operative executing a mission. "Call him off," the biker pleaded, genuine terror in his voice. "Please." "Rex, hold," Emma said firmly, using another command that Sarah must have taught her. The dog maintained his position, keeping the man immobilized without causing further harm. Mark quickly secured the dropped weapons before turning to Carter, medical training taking precedence. "Where are you hit?" The lighthouse keeper grimaced. "Grazed. Nothing vital." Despite his assurance, blood seeped steadily between his fingers. Mike stood frozen, staring at Rex in astonishment. "That's not just military training," he whispered. I've only seen dogs with that level of precision in Special Forces units." Mark ignored him, focusing on examining Carter's wound. The bullet had indeed scored a deep groove along his ribs without penetrating the chest cavity, painful but not immediately life-threatening if bleeding was controlled. He began applying pressure with a clean towel from the kitchen. "Emma, sweetheart, I need the first aid kit from the bathroom," Mark called, keeping his voice steady. His daughter's composure during crisis was remarkable, but he knew from medical experience that children could maintain extraordinary calm only to crash emotionally once danger passed. Emma disappeared briefly, returning with a well-stocked medical kit. Rex maintained his position guarding the subdued biker, the other two still unconscious on the floor. "Is Mr. Carter going to be okay?" Emma asked, watching as Mark cleaned and bandaged the wound with practiced efficiency. "Yes, sweetheart. It's not too deep." Mark secured the bandage. "You did exactly right with Rex. Sarah would be very proud of both of you." A flash of pain crossed the child's face at the mention of her father's cousin. Sarah said Rex was special, that he had important jobs before. "Very special," Mark agreed, wondering again exactly what Sarah had shared with Emma during her final days. "And his most important job now is keeping you safe." Carter struggled to sit up despite Mark's protests. "They'll radio back when these three don't report in. We don't have much time." The reality of their situation crashed back, but 3 bikers temporarily neutralized, but at least 12 more occupying the harbor below, with Jack Keller orchestrating their takeover. The storm had cut off access to outside help, and communication remained limited to Carter's emergency system. The lighthouse radio crackled to life with Pastor Mitchell's voice. "Carter? Mark? Steel Vipers have secured the marina and boat yard. They're demanding everyone gather at the community hall, claiming they're implementing emergency storm protocols for our safety." The skepticism in his tone was evident. Bill Thompson tried to resist and took a beating. "They're armed, organized, and using the storm as cover." Mark moved to respond, but stopped as Emma suddenly clutched Rex's collar, her face contorted in concentration. "Someone's coming," she whispered. "Rex can feel it." The dog had indeed shifted attention to the door, ears pivoting to track sounds below the storm's howl. Mark checked the unconscious bikers still secured with zip ties Carter had produced from a utility drawer, then moved cautiously to the window. Through sheets of rain, he could make out headlights creeping up the lighthouse access road, a larger vehicle struggling against the wind. "They sent reinforcements," Mike said, fear returning to his voice. Mark studied the approaching vehicle more carefully. "No, that's not a biker's truck. That's Bill's old Land Rover." Carter joined him at the window, one hand pressed against his bandaged side. "Someone's escaped from the marina roundup." Minutes later, urgent knocking brought Mark to the door, shotgun ready. "Who is it?" he called over the storm. "Sandra Kelly," came the rain-muffled reply. "Diego's with me. We got away when they were securing the boat yard." Mark admitted the chandlery owner and processing plant manager, both soaked and wide-eyed. Sandra's normally immaculate appearance was disheveled, a darkening bruise forming on her cheekbone. Diego had a makeshift bandage wrapped around his forearm, blood seeping through. "They're taking over the whole town," Sandra gasped as Mark helped her to a chair. Using the storm as cover, Jack Keller's set up command in the harbor master's office. Diego nodded grimly. "They have 15, maybe 20 men. Military precision. They're going building by building, collecting everyone at the community hall." "What about the church?" Pastor Mitchell radioed from there, Carter asked, checking the bandage on his side. "They haven't reached it yet," Sandra answered. "Higher ground, access road probably flooded by now. That's why we came here instead. Lighthouse Road is elevated." Mark assessed their situation rapidly. The immediate threat, 3 incapacitated bikers, was contained, but Emma remained in danger. Meanwhile, his community was being systematically corralled by armed men using a natural disaster as cover for their takeover. "What's the plan?" Carter asked quietly, recognizing the battlefield calculation in Mark's expression. Before Mark could answer, Emma spoke up from where she sat with Rex. "Daddy, we have to help our friends." The simple statement crystallized his decision. Harbor Point had embraced them when Catherine died. becoming extended family to his traumatized daughter. Running or hiding wasn't an option, not when the entire community faced threat. First, we need to understand who we're dealing with, Mark said. Mike, tell us everything about Jack Keller and his operation. The harbor master swallowed hard. Jack's ex-military force recon or something similar. Most of his inner circle are veterans, too. They target economically vulnerable coastal towns because local law enforcement is limited and response times from state authorities are slow. Their pattern is to establish dominance quickly through intimidation, then set up legitimate seeming security operations that are actually protection rackets. How did they recruit you? Diego asked, anger edging his voice. Mike's shoulders slumped. They found me in Atlantic City 8 months ago. I was in deep to loan sharks after my divorce. They paid my debts, then owned me instead. Had me feeding information about Harbor Point, which businesses were struggling, who might resist, who had influence. Shame colored his face. When I realized they were targeting a child, I tried to warn Mark. That's when Jack decided I'd outlived my usefulness. Sandra studied their 3 captives. What do we do with them? Secure them in the lighthouse storage room, Carter decided. They'll be safe from the storm, but contained. As Diego and Mike moved the bound men, Mark consulted the hurricane tracking map Carter had spread across his table. The storm's eye would pass directly over Harbor Point around midnight, creating a brief window of calm before the second half hit. We need to use the eye's passage, Mark said. It's our only advantage 15 to 20 minutes when they'll think the storm's passed. Carter nodded, understanding. Surprise and environmental advantage. Classic small force multiplier. Diego returned, rolling down his sleeves over his bandaged arm. Even with surprise, we're outnumbered and outgunned. What exactly are you thinking, Mark? Not a frontal assault, Mark clarified. We need to isolate Jack from his support. Cut the head off the snake. The harbor master's office, Mike suggested. If he's using it as a command center, we could. A sudden bark from Rex interrupted the planning. The dog had moved to the window, alertness evident in every muscle. Emma joined him, peering through rain-streaked glass. Daddy, someone's running up the path. Mark moved quickly to the window, raising Carter's binoculars. Through the driving rain, he could make out a small figure struggling against the wind, periodically falling to hands and knees before pressing forward again. It's a child, he realized with shock. One of the Morgan twins. Carter unlocked the door as Mark rushed out into the storm, fighting horizontal rain to reach the exhausted boy. 10-year-old Aiden Morgan collapsed into Mark's arms, coughing and shivering violently. Inside, Sandra wrapped the boy in blankets while Mark checked his vital signs. Mild hypothermia, but his core temperature is still adequate, he diagnosed. Aiden, what happened? Where's your family? Men. Between chattering teeth, the boy's story emerged. The Morgan family had been among those gathered at the community hall when Aiden slipped away, determined to find help after seeing Bill Thompson beaten. His twin brother had created a distraction while Aiden escaped through a bathroom window. They each have Emma's friends, he managed, looking up at the little girl with fierce protective instinct despite his own condition. The Johnson baby is crying, and they won't let Mrs. Johnson feed her. And they hit Mr. Thompson when he tried to help. Mark exchanged glances with Carter. The situation was deteriorating faster than anticipated. Children and elderly were particularly vulnerable to delayed medical care during disasters if the Steel Vipers were preventing basic care. The threat had escalated beyond intimidation to genuine life-threatening conditions. But they're looking for Emma, Aiden continued, warming slowly under the blankets. The big man, their leader, he keeps asking where she is. Says he needs leverage against you. The implication sent ice through Mark's veins. Jack Keller wasn't just implementing a standard intimidation protocol, he was specifically targeting Emma as a means of controlling Harbor Point through Mark. Change of plans, Mark said quietly. I need to get to the community hall before someone else gets hurt because of us. You can't just surrender, Sandra protested. That's exactly what they want. I'm not surrendering, Mark clarified. But I need to see exactly what we're dealing with. Scout the situation, identify vulnerabilities. Carter studied him with the understanding of someone who'd faced similar tactical decisions. You'll need backup and a way to communicate what you find. I'll go, Diego volunteered immediately. Mark shook his head. No. You, Sandra, and Mike need to reach the church using Bill's Land Rover. Warn Pastor Mitchell about what's happening and prepare for possible evacuees if we can create an extraction opportunity. What about Emma? Sandra asked, glancing at the little girl who sat quietly beside the recovering Aiden. Rex maintained perfect positioning between her and the door. Mark knelt before his daughter, choosing his words carefully. Emma, sweetheart, I need you to go with MS. Sandra to the church. Rex will. No, Emma interrupted with unexpected firmness. Rex and I stay together, Sarah said always. The adults exchanged glances, recognizing the immovable determination in the child's face. Mark had seen that expression before when Catherine died, when Emma insisted on returning to the dock where the accident happened, facing her fears directly instead of avoiding them. Mark, Carter said quietly, that dog isn't just protection, he's specialized recon, if I'm reading his training correctly. And he responds to Emma's commands in ways he doesn't with anyone else. The realization struck Mark with sudden clarity. Sarah hadn't simply left Rex as a companion for Emma, she'd left a highly trained military asset with specific capabilities, and had somehow transferred handler commands to a child who would never raise suspicion. It was brilliantly protective thinking from a dying woman who understood exactly what her trained partner could provide. We use the storm, Mark decided finally. Carter and I will approach the community hall during the storm's advance. Emma and Rex will remain here with Mike guarding the lighthouse. Sandra and Diego will secure the church as our fallback position. When the eye passes, we implement extraction of the most vulnerable community members. And Jack Keller? Mike asked. Mark's expression hardened. Jack made this personal when he targeted my daughter. During my last deployment, I watched Sarah and Rex extract high-value targets from situations far more dangerous than a storm-isolated fishing village. I learned a few things. The planning continued as the storm reached its peak fury around the lighthouse, the structure's solid construction creaking but holding firm against nature's onslaught. As midnight approached, Mark checked his gear one final time, medical supplies primarily, but also items that could serve defensive purposes if necessary. Carter cleaned his shotgun methodically, the actions of a man who had prepared for battle many times before. Emma sat with Rex near the window, one small hand buried in the shepherd's fur, watching the storm with unusual intensity. The quiet part is coming, she said suddenly, with a certainty that made the adults pause. Rex can feel it. Mark studied his daughter, wondering again what Sarah had taught her during those final hospital visits. How much did Emma understand about Rex's capabilities? How deeply had Sarah prepared them both for a world she wouldn't be part of? Emma, he said gently, when we go out there, I need you to be brave and stay with Mike. Rex needs to? Rex needs to protect the pack, Emma interrupted with surprising authority. Sarah said that's his most important job. She looked up at her father with eyes too wise for her 6 years. But Daddy, you're part of our pack too. The simple statement struck Mark with physical force. Emma wasn't just deciding to keep Rex with her, she was recognizing that her father faced danger and needed protection too. Before he could respond, Rex moved to stand between them, looking from father to daughter with clear intelligence, waiting for resolution of the conflicting priorities. The lighthouse radio crackled again, Pastor Mitchell reporting deteriorating conditions at the community hall. Bill Thompson's condition was worsening, his head injury untreated. The Johnson baby was showing signs of dehydration. Jack Keller had begun separating men from women and children, standard intimidation tactics. Decision time had arrived. The brief eye of the hurricane would pass over Harbor Point within the hour, creating their only window of opportunity. Mark looked from his daughter to the loyal shepherd who had protected her since Sarah's death, recognizing that he had never fully understood the depths of what his cousin had entrusted to them. "Emma," he said finally, "I think it's time we let Rex show these people exactly what happens when someone threatens a military dog's family." The storm howled its agreement as Harbor Point's defenders prepared to reclaim their community from those who had gravely underestimated the bonds between a child, her dog, Bay, and the town that had become their home. The storm reached its catastrophic peak as Mark and Carter made their final preparations. Wind-driven rain hammered the lighthouse with such violence that conversation became nearly impossible without shouting. Through the windows, Harbor Point had disappeared beneath a churning darkness broken only by occasional lightning flashes that revealed the devastation below. Boats torn from moorings, debris flying through flooded streets, the harbor's infrastructure crumbling beneath nature's assault. Storm surges higher than predicted. Carter shouted over the howling wind, studying his barometer with concern. 8 feet at least. Downtown's underwater. Mark's tactical calculations shifted immediately. Flooding meant limited access routes, potential building instabilities, and new dangers beyond the human threat they faced. The community hall sat on relatively high ground, but the surrounding streets would be impassable except by boat. The harbor master's office, where Jack had established his command center, was certainly flooded by now. "We need to assume they've relocated to higher ground," Mark said. "Probably consolidated everyone at the community hall." Emma approached, Rex at her side as always. The German shepherd moved with the focused alertness of an operative preparing for deployment, his bond with the child more evident than ever as they communicated through subtle gestures that required no words. "Rex says the rain is getting softer," Emma reported, interpreting the dog's behavior with remarkable accuracy. "The quiet part is coming soon." Mark checked his watch. Nearly midnight, when meteorologists had predicted the hurricane's eye would pass directly over Harbor Point. Emma's interpretation of Rex's sensitivity to barometric pressure changes aligned perfectly with scientific forecasts, but another indication of the sophisticated training the dog possessed. "Time to move," Carter confirmed, securing additional ammunition for his shotgun. His wounded side clearly pained him, but the lighthouse keeper's determination never wavered. Mark knelt before Emma, meeting her eyes directly. "Sweetheart, I need you to stay here with Mike. Rex will." "No, Daddy," Emma interrupted with unexpected firmness. "Rex comes with you." She made a subtle hand gesture that caused the shepherd to move to Mark's side, looking up expectantly. "Emma, you need protection too," Mark insisted gently. "Mr. Mike has guns. Rex has training." Emma's simple logic was irrefutable. "Sarah said Rex can find people better than anyone. You need to find our friends." Mark exchanged glances with Carter, both recognizing the strategic validity of the child's assessment. Rex's military training would provide advantages that might prove crucial to locating and extracting hostages. "She's right," Mike said reluctantly. "I can defend the lighthouse. That dog's capabilities would help you more than staying here." The decision was made as the storm's ferocity began to diminish noticeably, signaling the hurricane eye's approach. Mark hugged Emma tightly, inhaling the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her small arms around his neck. "I'll be back soon," he promised. "Listen to Mike. Stay inside no matter what you hear." Emma nodded solemnly. "Find our friends, Daddy. Bring them home." Mark and Carter departed through the lighthouse's heavy door into the gradually calming storm, Rex padding silently between them. The descent from the lighthouse was treacherous. Fallen trees blocked portions of the path, and surging water had washed away sections entirely. By the time they reached the bottom, eerie stillness had begun to replace the storm's rage as the hurricane eye moved over Harbor Point. Moonlight broke through dissipating clouds, revealing a landscape transformed by destruction. Main Street had become a river carrying debris from shattered storefronts. Fishing boats lay capsized in front yards. Power lines dangled dangerously across flooded intersections. "We've got maybe 15 minutes before the back wall hits," Carter warned, "Study in the clearing sky. Need to move fast." They advanced through knee-deep water, navigating by memory more than sight. Rex moved ahead, periodically returning to check their progress, his training evident in his silent, efficient movements. As they approached the community hall, lights became visible through windows, the building's emergency generator apparently still functioning. Mark signaled for a halt as they reached the edge of the property. 2 armed men stood guard at the main entrance, while a third patrolled the perimeter. And through windows, dozens of townspeople could be seen gathered inside, families clustered together, elderly residents seated along walls, several injured community members receiving inadequate attention. "I count 28 hostages," Carter whispered after studying the scene through binoculars. 3 injured requiring immediate care. Bill Thompson looks critical, probable concussion, maybe intracranial bleeding from his coloring. Mark's medical training immediately registered the urgency. Head injuries left untreated could quickly become fatal, especially without access to advanced care during the storm. The elderly Johnson sisters both appeared to be in respiratory distress, likely asthma exacerbated by stress and the hurricane's pressure changes. 7 armed bikers visible. Mark continued the assessment. Jack's not among them. Rex suddenly tense beside them, hackles rising slightly as he oriented toward the building's rear exit. Mark followed the dog's focus to see Jack Keller emerging, accompanied by 2 lieutenants. The Steel Viper's leader appeared to be coordinating hurricane response rather than simply terrorizing hostages, directing his men to reinforce windows as the eye walls approached. Loomed. "Lee." "Smart," Carter acknowledged grudgingly. "He's using the disaster to establish legitimacy. He positions himself as the only authority figure capable of ensuring survival." The tactical situation presented no clear advantage. 3 rescuers against at least 10 armed opponents, with dozens of vulnerable hostages in a rapidly deteriorating natural disaster. Direct confrontation would endanger the very people they sought to protect. "We need a diversion," Mark decided, "something to separate Jack from his support structure." Before they could develop a plan, catastrophe struck without warning. The community hall's roof, weakened by hurricane winds, partially collapsed with a sickening crack. Screams erupted from inside as a section of ceiling crashed down, trapping several people beneath debris. Jack and his men rushed inside, temporarily abandoning exterior security in response to the emergency. Without hesitation, Mark signaled to Carter and Rex, and the trio rushed forward to exploit the chaos. Inside, they found pandemonium. Dust filled the air as people screamed and struggled to free those trapped beneath fallen beams. Jack was directing his men to stabilize remaining structural elements while simultaneously attempting to lift a massive support beam that had pinned several townspeople. Mark assessed the situation with combat medic precision. The collapse had trapped 5 people, Mrs. Johnson clutching her infant, Bill Thompson, whose earlier injuries were now compounded, and the elderly Martinez couple who had operated the processing plant for 40 years. All required immediate extraction, but the beam's positioning made conventional removal impossible without specialized equipment. "We need help here," Jack shouted upon seeing Mark enter, momentarily forgetting their adversarial relationship in the face of immediate crisis. "This whole section could go any minute." Mark didn't hesitate, moving directly to assist despite Carter's warning gesture. Some imperatives transcended conflict. Trapped children and injured elderly represented a priority that overrode tactical considerations. "We need to stabilize the beam before attempting extraction," Mark directed, automatically assuming command of the medical emergency. "Carter, find something we can use as a brace. Jack, get your strongest men on the north end." The unexpected cooperation between adversaries created momentary confusion among the Steel Vipers, but survival instincts prevailed over gang loyalty. As they worked to stabilize the collapsing structure, Mark quickly triaged the trapped victims. "Bill's condition is critical," he reported, checking the fisherman's dilated pupils. "Probable epidural hematoma. He needs immediate decompression or he'll die within hours." "Hospitals cut off by flooding," Jack responded, strain evident as he helped brace the beam. Medevac impossible in these conditions. Mark met his eyes across the trapped victims. I performed emergency burr holes in Afghanistan with less equipment than we have here. But I need space, light, and assistance. Understanding passed between the men and acknowledgement that some situations demanded setting aside enmity for a greater purpose. Jack nodded once. Whatever you need. As they struggled to free the trapped townspeople, a new sound penetrated the momentary calm, the hurricane's second eye wall approaching with renewed fury. The building groaned ominously as wind began to intensify. Structures compromised, Carter warned, examining splintered support columns. We need to evacuate everyone before the backside of the storm hits. Evacuation to where? Jack demanded. Everywhere else is flooded or damaged. The lighthouse, Mark answered immediately. Highest ground, strongest construction. But we need to move now while we still have a window. A terrible cracking sound interrupted their planning as another section of roof began to give way. Carter lunged forward, shouldering a support beam that threatened to collapse onto the trapped Johnson baby. The weight drove him to his knees, his earlier wound reopening with the strain. Can't hold it long, he gasped, blood seeping through his bandages. Rex darted forward without command, squeezing beneath the debris to reach the infant. With careful gentleness that belied his military training, the shepherd managed to create space for Mark to extract the baby, passing the crying child to its mother's outstretched arms. The rescue came at terrible cost. As the last victim was pulled free, the weakened structure gave way completely. Carter, still bracing the critical support beam, had no time to escape. "Oh, cuz, His eyes met Mark's briefly, a look of acceptance, of knowing sacrifice before tons of debris crashed down, burying the lighthouse keeper beneath splintered wood and roofing. No, Mark lunged toward the collapse, but Jack's strong arms held him back. "He's gone," the biker leader said grimly. "Building's coming down. We need to get these people out now." Outside, the hurricane's fury returned with even greater intensity than before. The eye had passed, and with it their window for safe evacuation. Harbor Point now faced a desperate fight for survival against both natural disaster and human threat, with their most vulnerable citizens injured and their strongest defender sacrificed. As if understanding the gravity of their situation, Rex pressed against Mark's side, eyes focused on the path back toward the lighthouse where Emma waited. The shepherd's posture communicated clear intent. They had rescued some, lost one, but their mission remained incomplete. "Everyone capable of walking help someone who isn't," Mark commanded, medical authority overriding all other considerations. "We make for the lighthouse. It's our only chance now." As the surviving townspeople organized into an evacuation column, Mark felt Jack Keller's presence beside him. The Steel Viper's leader studied him with new understanding. "Your dog," Jack said quietly. "Military trained, isn't he? Like his handler." Mark met the man's gaze directly. "My cousin's. She died saving her unit in Afghanistan. Her last request was that Rex protect my daughter." Something shifted in Jack's expression, recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "3rd Battalion?" The specific question gave Mark pause. "How did you know?" Before Jack could answer, the building shuddered again beneath the hurricane's renewed assault. Time for revelations had passed. Survival now depended on reaching higher ground before Harbor Point was completely overwhelmed by the perfect storm of natural disaster and human conflict. With Carter's sacrifice weighing heavily on their hearts, the unlikely alliance of townspeople, reluctant bikers, and a military-trained shepherd began their desperate journey through the storm's most violent phase. The lighthouse beacon, their only guide through darkness that threatened to consume them all. The journey to the lighthouse became a nightmarish gauntlet as the hurricane's second wall struck Harbor Point with even greater fury than before. Mark led the desperate procession of townspeople through flooded streets, the injured carried on makeshift stretchers fashioned from debris. Jack and his remaining Steel Vipers formed a protective perimeter. their earlier intimidation tactics replaced by genuine efforts to shepherd the vulnerable through nature's onslaught. Rex navigated ahead, somehow finding passable routes through the chaos, periodically returning to guide them around new obstacles. Bill Thompson's condition deteriorated with each passing minute. Mark periodically halted their progress to check his pupils, apply manual pressure to control intracranial bleeding, and adjust the crude cervical stabilization they'd improvised. The fishermen needed immediate surgical intervention that only the lighthouse's better-equipped first aid station might provide. How much further? Jack shouted over howling wind, supporting an elderly woman whose arthritis prevented rapid movement. Quarter mile. Mark called back, mentally calculating Bill's remaining time. But the road's gone washed out completely. We'll need to climb the eastern approach. The eastern path to the lighthouse was steeper, more treacherous, but remained their only option as floodwaters had claimed the main access road. Jack gestured to his men, redirecting their formation to better protect the weakest evacuees during the climb. Halfway up the steep incline, disaster struck again. The saturated ground gave way beneath the stretcher carrying Bill Thompson. 2 townspeople and one of Jack's men tumbled downward in a cascade of mud and rocks, the injured fisherman sliding dangerously toward the surging waters below. Without hesitation, Jack launched himself down the slope, somehow maintaining footing where others had fallen. He caught Bill's stretcher mere feet from the floodwaters, anchoring it against the powerful current with his own body while shouting for assistance. Mark secured a rope from Carter's emergency supplies around his waist and descended to help, shocked by Jack's unhesitating risk to save a man he'd ordered beaten hours earlier. Together, they stabilized the stretcher and began the grueling process of ascending the muddy slope with their critical patient. Why? Mark gasped as they struggled upward. Why save him after ordering him hurt? Jack's face registered genuine confusion through the rain streaming down his features. I never ordered anyone beaten, especially not civilians. Before Mark could process this contradiction, Rex's bark alerted them to a new danger. The lighthouse beam, their guiding star through the tempest, had suddenly gone dark. Without its directional marker, the evacuation party risked becoming disoriented in the storm's fury. Mike should have maintained the emergency generator, Mark shouted, worry for Emma overwhelming all other considerations. Something's wrong. They redoubled their efforts, the remaining steel vipers forming a human chain to help the weakest climbers navigate the treacherous final approach. When they finally reached the lighthouse grounds, they found the heavy entrance door ajar, a security breach that sent ice through Mark's veins. Emma, he called, rushing inside with Rex bounding ahead. The lighthouse interior was dark except for emergency lighting, the generator silent. Signs of struggle were evident: overturned furniture, scattered supplies, a smear of blood on the wall near the communications equipment. Mike Henderson lay unconscious near the stairwell, a deep gash across his forehead. Rex's behavior shifted instantly from guide to hunter, his posture lowering as he moved methodically through the ground floor, tracking something only his trained senses could detect. Mark followed, heart pounding, calling his daughter's name with increasing desperation. The shepherd stopped abruptly outside the small storage room where they'd secured the 3 captured bikers. The door stood open, the prisoners gone. Rex's attention focused upward toward the lighthouse living quarters with laser intensity. Jack, Mark called, barely controlling his panic. Get everyone inside and secure the door. I need to find Emma. Without waiting for a response, Mark followed Rex up the spiral staircase, moving as silently as his military training allowed. The dog preceded him like a shadow, each movement calculated and precise. They found Emma in Carter's living quarters, unharmed but not alone. She sat calmly on the edge of a chair, watching as one of the escaped bikers attempted to repair the lighthouse generator controls. The other 2 captives stood nearby, but made no threatening moves toward the child. Emma. Mark rushed forward, positioning himself between his daughter and the potential threats. It's okay, Daddy, Emma said with surprising composure. They're fixing the lights. The big storm knocked them out. Mark stared in confusion at the scene, his 6-year-old daughter apparently unafraid, the escaped captives focused on restoring power rather than escaping or causing harm. One of the men, the youngest of the three, raised his hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Sir, we're not with them, not really," he explained hurriedly. "We're undercover DEA, Operation Coastal Watch. We've been embedded with the Steel Vipers for 14 months tracking their distribution network." The revelation landed like a physical blow. DA? Then why? "We couldn't break cover," the agent continued. "Not until we identified all the key players in their interstate operation. Jack Keller wasn't our target, he's just the visible front. We've been tracking his supplier, a cartel connection moving product through small coastal ports." As if summoned by his name, Jack appeared in the doorway, Rex immediately positioning himself between the biker leader and Emma. "Agent Delaney?" Jack's voice carried genuine shock. "What the hell is happening here?" The undercover agent straightened, authority replacing his earlier subservient demeanor. "Operations compromised, Keller. We need to adapt." Mark looked between them, pieces falling into place with dizzying speed. "You're working together? You're with law enforcement?" Jack's expression hardened. "Not exactly. I'm what they call a confidential informant. Cut a deal after my last deployment went sideways." His eyes met Mark's with unexpected honesty. "Marines, 3rd Battalion. Came home with some bad habits, worse connections. DA offered alternatives to a 20-year sentence." The truth unfolded in rapid succession. Jack Keller, former Marine turned confidential informant, had been working with the DEA to expose a smuggling operation using Harbor Point's isolated location as a transfer point. Mike Henderson wasn't compromised. Through gambling debts, he was being blackmailed by the real criminals who had evidence of his involvement in minor cargo theft. "The Steel Vipers protection racket is real," Agent Delaney explained as his partner successfully restored power to the lighthouse. "But it's a cover for identifying vulnerable coastal infrastructure. Jack's role was to establish presence without causing serious harm until we could identify the local distribution connections." "Then who attacked Emma this morning?" Mark demanded. "Who ordered Bill Thompson beaten?" Jack's face darkened with genuine anger. "Ramirez and Holt, 2 of my crew, who weren't following protocol. They were supposed to make a show of intimidation, not target children or implement actual violence." He shook his head in disgust. "I dealt with them when I found out, sent them back to base camp before the storm hit. Never authorized threatening a kid." Emma, who had been listening with remarkable attentiveness, suddenly spoke up. "The man at the harbor office told them to scare me. I heard him on the phone when Rex and I were hiding." All eyes turned to the child. "Mike Henderson?" Mark asked in disbelief. Emma shook her head. "Not Mr. Mike. The other man who came in sometimes. The one with the shiny shoes who talks funny." Callahan, Jack, and Agent Delaney said simultaneously. "A regional Coast Guard inspector," the agent explained grimly. "We've suspected he was the cartel's main coordinator, using his official position to facilitate transfers and provide intelligence on patrol patterns. If he specifically targeted your daughter, it means he identified you as a threat." Mark struggled to process the cascade of revelations. "But why target a 6-year-old girl?" "I'm just a charter boat captain." Jack studied him with new understanding. "Who was previously a Navy combat medic attached to Marine units in high-value target extraction operations. Who is now raising his daughter near a suspected drug transfer point. Whose cousin was a decorated K-9 handler with specialized operations background." He gestured toward Rex, who maintained perfect vigilance beside Emma. "And who has a military-trained shepherd that could potentially detect smuggled substances. From Callahan's perspective, you're either an undercover operator or a significant security risk." The complexity of the situation left Mark momentarily speechless. Harbor Point hadn't been randomly selected for a protection racket had been strategically targeted by sophisticated drug traffickers using the Steel Vipers' intimidation tactics as cover. The morning's confrontation at the dock wasn't a simple shakedown, it was a calculated attempt to assess whether Mark posed a threat to their operation. Before he could fully absorb these implications, urgent calls from below refocused their priorities. The evacuated townspeople needed immediate medical attention, particularly Bill Thompson, whose condition remained critical. "We need to table this discussion," Mark decided. "People are dying downstairs." Jack nodded agreement. "My men will secure the perimeter. Your dog can help identify any threats we haven't accounted for." As they descended to assist the injured, Mark noticed Emma's hand slipping into Jack's with surprising trust. The biker leader or confidential informant looked down in momentary surprise before gently squeezing the child's fingers. "Your dog," Jack said quietly to Emma, "reminds me of ones we worked with overseas. Special animals that saved a lot of lives." Emma nodded solemnly. "Sarah said Rex was a hero before he came to us. She said sometimes heroes have to pretend to be something else so they can help people who need them." The simple wisdom from a child's perspective struck both men deeply. As they rejoined the community gathered in the lighthouse's main level, the boundaries between adversaries and allies had fundamentally shifted. Harbor Point's residents watched in confusion as Mark and Jack seamlessly coordinated emergency care, the Steel Vipers following their leader's example by providing assistance rather than intimidation. Rex moved among the injured with surprising gentleness, somehow sensing those in greatest distress and positioning himself where his calm presence provided comfort. When he finally settled beside Bill Thompson's makeshift operating area, the dog's steady presence seemed to anchor both patient and improvised medical team through the delicate procedure. As Mark carefully relieved pressure on the fisherman's brain using techniques learned in far-off combat zones, Jack provided critical assistance, and his hands steady and movements precise. Their shared military background created an unexpected synchronicity that transcended their previous conflict. "We were on opposite sides of the same war," Jack observed quietly as they worked. "Now we're on the same side in a different one." Outside, the hurricane continued its assault on Harbor Point, but within the lighthouse walls, something powerful had transformed. The revelation of hidden truths had redrawn alliances, creating unexpected bonds forged in crisis. As dawn approached, the storm's fury finally began to diminish, mirroring the dissolving tensions within the sanctuary they had created together. 1 week after the hurricane devastated Harbor Point, the community gathered on the rebuilt fishing dock to assess their progress. The physical damage remained evident: splintered pilings, damaged boats, businesses with boarded windows, but something less tangible had been restored. American flags flew from nearly every structure still standing, their symbolism of resilience particularly poignant in the morning light. Mark Jenkins supervised as local fishermen maneuvered a newly repaired charter boat into its slip. His medical expertise had transitioned from emergency trauma care to rehabilitation coordination, to establishing treatment protocols for those still recovering from storm-related injuries. Bill Thompson sat nearby on a folding chair, a neat surgical bandage on his head testament to Mark's life-saving intervention during the height of the crisis. "Doctor says I can be back on the water in another 2 weeks," Bill announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a man who understood how close he'd come to never returning home. He said, "If it weren't for your battlefield surgery, I'd be having this conversation with St. Peter instead." Emma played at the dock's edge, Rex maintaining perfect positioning between her and the water. The German shepherd's demeanor had subtly shifted since the storm, still vigilant, but somehow more integrated into the community that now recognized his protective significance. Neighborhood children approached with cautious respect, having witnessed the dog's disciplined heroism during evacuation efforts. The rumble of motorcycles no longer triggered alarm as Jack Keller and 3 remaining Steel Vipers arrived to continue cleanup operations. Their leather cuts now bore a small addition, an American flag patch with Harbor Point embroidered beneath it. The transformation from intimidators to community defenders had occurred so naturally that few remembered to question it. Morning, Jenkins' family, Jack called, dismounting with the ease of someone comfortable in his surroundings. He approached Emma with a respectful nod toward Rex, who had assessed and dismissed any threat from the visitor. "Little lady, I brought something for that heroic partner of yours." From his saddlebag, Jack produced a specialized tactical collar with reinforced handling loops and reflective strips. "A military issue," he explained to Mark. Thought he deserved proper equipment, given his service record. As they fitted the collar to an appreciative Rex, Mike Henderson approached hesitantly. The harbor master's role in events remained complicated, not a willing conspirator in Callahan's smuggling operation, but a man whose poor choices had created vulnerability. His efforts during recovery had been tireless, however, as he worked to rebuild both the harbor and his reputation. The Coast Guard finally reached the western inlet, Mike reported. "They've recovered Carter's." He paused, glancing at Emma before adjusting his phrasing. "They brought him home." The news sobered the gathering. Carter Dawson's sacrifice had become Harbor Point's rallying point. The lighthouse keeper who died ensuring others would live embodied the community's finest qualities. "We'll have a proper service," Mark decided. "Military honors. Carter deserves that recognition." Jack nodded agreement. "My contacts can arrange it. Marines take care of their own, even the ones who preferred solitude." Their conversation was interrupted as Sandra Kelly approached with clipboard in hand, her organizational skills having proven invaluable during reconstruction. "But the community center roof is finally secured," she reported. "Diego's coordinating deliveries of replacement processing equipment." And she brightened visibly. "We've received confirmation that federal disaster funds have been approved." "Good," Mark acknowledged. "And the other situation?" Sandra lowered her voice, though Emma remained deliberately distracted by Rex's new collar. "The DEA operation concluded successfully yesterday. Agent Delaney says they've apprehended Callahan and 3 others at a secondary location. The evidence chain is solid." The news represented closure to a chapter Harbor Point hadn't known it was part of until the hurricane forced revelations. The coastal drug trafficking operation had been dismantled, its infrastructure exposed by the very storm that had nearly destroyed the town. Mike interjected nervously, "There's something else." He handed over an official-looking envelope. "This came through on the emergency fax from the medical center in Portland." Mark opened it with measured calm that dissolved into visible emotion as he scanned the contents. Emma noticed immediately, moving to her father's side with the instinctive concern of a child who had witnessed too much loss. "Daddy, is someone hurt?" Mark knelt to her level, struggling to maintain composure. "No, sweetheart, it's about your hearing." He showed her the medical authorization priority approval for the specialized surgical intervention that insurance had repeatedly denied. "The doctors in Portland can help you. They have an opening next month." Emma's eyes widened with cautious hope. Her partial hearing loss had been deemed permanent. After Catherine's accident, the specialized treatment deemed experimental by insurance providers despite promising results. "How?" Mark asked, looking to Mike for explanation. The harbor master shrugged. "Came through official channels. Something about service-connected priority designation." Jack's expression revealed nothing, but a knowing glance passed between him and Agent Delaney, who had approached silently during the exchange. The DEA officer cleared his throat. "Certain federal provisions exist for families of those who serve in specialized capacities," he explained carefully. "Your cousin Sarah's service record warranted particular considerations. Sometimes paperwork just needs the right signatures." Mark understood the unspoken message. Jack had leveraged his connections to secure treatment for Emma, repaying a debt that existed between warriors rather than enemies. His gratitude remained unspoken but evident as the 2 men exchanged nods of understanding. 3 months after the hurricane, Harbor Point hosted the grand opening of its rebuilt community center. The transformation extended beyond repaired infrastructure to something more fundamental in the town's character. Where isolated fishing families had once maintained polite distance, genuine bonds now connected households that had weathered disaster together. The community center featured a new addition, a memorial wall honoring Carter Dawson, whose sacrifice remained Harbor Point's defining moment of courage. His lighthouse keeping equipment had been preserved in a display case alongside photographs documenting his earlier military service, previously unknown to most residents. Emma's recovery from her successful hearing procedure progressed remarkably. The specialized intervention had restored significant auditory function, though she still relied on Rex's alerting behaviors for certain sound ranges. The bond between child and dog had evolved rather than diminished with her improved hearing. Rex remained her constant companion, his military training now openly acknowledged and respected throughout Harbor Point. Mark's charter fishing business had expanded to include weekend tours specifically highlighting marine conservation and harbor history. Many tourists came specifically to meet the famous military dog they'd seen featured in regional news coverage of Harbor Point's hurricane recovery. Rex accepted the attention with dignified tolerance, maintaining his disciplined bearing while allowing children to pat his head under Emma's careful supervision. Jack Keller's role had transformed as well. His official status as confidential informant concluded after the smuggling operation's dismantling, leaving him free to pursue legitimate business. To everyone's surprise, he established Harbor Point's first security consulting operation, specializing in maritime facility protection. Several reformed Steel Vipers found employment within his company, their motorcycles now displaying Harbor Point security insignias beneath American flags. 6 months after the hurricane, Harbor Point's annual Memorial Day service for those lost at sea took on expanded significance. The community gathered at dusk along the rebuilt harbor, fishing boats arranged in ceremonial formation offshore. Carter Dawson's name had been added to the memorial plaque, his lighthouse service acknowledged alongside his military contributions. Emma stood between her father and Jack Keller, Rex sitting at perfect attention beside them. In her hand, she held a small candle-lit boat, the traditional tribute Harbor Point residents sent into the waters to honor those who never returned. As darkness fell, hundreds of similar memorials drifted outward with the tide, creating a constellation of remembrance upon the water. Sarah would have loved this, Emma said quietly, watching her tribute join the others. She told me Harbor Point would always be the safest place because the strongest people live near the sea. Mark placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, unsurprised by her wisdom yet constantly amazed by her resilience. On her other side, Jack nodded agreement, his transformation from adversary to ally complete. To those who served, Jack said softly, raising his hand in a subtle salute as the memorial lights drifted toward the horizon. To those who protected, Mark continued, his gaze moving to Rex, whose disciplined vigilance never truly ceased even in moments of ceremony. To those who came home, Emma concluded, reaching down to touch Rex's head with gentle appreciation and brought their courage with them. As Harbor Point's community stood united beneath a sky filled with stars, the lighthouse beam swept across peaceful waters, Carter's legacy continuing its vigilant guidance. On shore, a former Navy medic, his partially healed daughter, a reformed Marine, and a retired military dog stood together in perfect understanding that some bonds, once formed in crisis, become foundations upon which better futures are built. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.